Welcome to Apex Storyteller, where scary stories lead you to a peaceful night's rest. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin this spine-chilling journey together. The platform was deserted. A biting wind whistled through the cracks of the ancient wooden beams, carrying with it the faint sound of a distant train whistle. The air seemed charged, thick with an energy that pressed against the chest and made even the bravest soul second-guess the shadows. In the small, forgotten town of Ravenwood, this train station had seen better days, back when it ferried commuters to the city and brought travelers seeking solace in its picturesque countryside. But tonight, under the dim glow of a single flickering bulb, the station felt like a place time had deliberately abandoned. Maggie Hart, a journalist from Chicago, stood near the edge of the platform, clutching a flashlight that was starting to betray her. A soft curse escaped her lips as the beam flickered and dimmed. "Figures," she muttered. Maggie was here on assignment, investigating the strange disappearances that had plagued Ravenwood for years. Locals whispered about the station how it was the last place anyone ever saw the missing. Stories of ghostly trains and phantom passengers swirled in the town's collective memory, but Maggie had always dismissed such tales as superstition. Yet, as the oppressive silence pressed in around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching. Suddenly, a sound cut through the stillness. Not the whistle of a train, but a rhythmic, metallic clanging. It came from somewhere deep down the tracks, echoing off the station's cracked tiles. Maggie's flashlight wavered as she swept the beam toward the source. Nothing. Just an endless stretch of darkness. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. Relief washed over her briefly as she pulled it out, only for confusion to take its place. The screen wasn't displaying a call or message, just static. Then the static began to shift, forming distorted shapes that resembled faces writhing in agony. A harsh, grating noise filled her ears, forcing her to drop the phone. She covered her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it seemed to vibrate through her very bones. "You're still here," came a voice, smooth and low, from somewhere in the inky darkness. Maggie spun around, heart pounding. Her flashlight beam darted wildly, revealing nothing but empty benches and the peeling paint of the station walls. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice firm but edged with panic. The voice replied, calm and deliberate. "You shouldn't have come." The platform beneath her feet trembled slightly, as though something massive was stirring deep below. Maggie's instincts screamed at her to leave, but the journalist in her pushed forward. She had to know what was going on here. Her light caught something pinned to a nearby bench, a weathered piece of paper fluttering in the wind. She stepped closer and saw it was an old train schedule. The times made no sense. Midnight, 3:13 a.m., 4:44 a.m. The destinations were equally cryptic. Lost, unknown, and nowhere. Her stomach churned as her eyes landed on the date at the top of the schedule. It was today. Below the date, scrawled in shaky red handwriting, was a single word: passenger. The clanging sound returned, louder now, accompanied by the unmistakable rumble of an approaching train. Maggie's flashlight flickered violently before plunging her into darkness. But ahead, cutting through the gloom, twin beams of light appeared, the headlights of a train. The air grew colder, and the pressure around her intensified as the train pulled into the station. It was unlike any train Maggie had ever seen. Sleek and black, its surface seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The windows were darkened, revealing nothing of the interior. The train came to a stop with an eerie silence. No screeching brakes, no hiss of steam. The doors slid open smoothly, revealing a dimly lit interior bathed in crimson light. Maggie's body tensed. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn around and run, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as though the train was calling to her, pulling her forward with an invisible force. Before she realized what she was doing, she stepped inside. The doors closed behind her with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. The interior was unsettlingly elegant. The seats were upholstered in dark velvet, and ornate chandeliers hung from the ceiling, swaying gently as though the train were already moving. Maggie walked slowly down the aisle, her breath shallow and uneven. Then she saw it, a seat with her name engraved on a brass plate. Below her name, another word was etched: passenger. Her phone buzzed again. She pulled it out, and this time the screen displayed a single message: "Stay seated." Before she could react, the train lurched forward, throwing her into the seat with her name on it. She tried to get up, but an unseen force held her in place. Outside the windows, the world dissolved into a swirling vortex of shadows, shapes, and faint, ghostly figures reaching out as if trying to grasp the train as it sped past. Maggie's pulse raced. She didn't know where this train was taking her, but one thing was certain. She wasn't alone. The voice returned, softer this time, almost a whisper in her ear. "Welcome aboard, passenger. The journey has just begun." Maggie's heart thundered in her chest as the train plunged deeper into the darkness. The eerie, crimson light bathed the interior in an unsettling glow, casting long, unnatural shadows across the velvet seats. It felt as though time had stopped altogether. No sound of passing landscape, no movement beyond the train itself. Just an unending expanse of blackness pressing in on all sides. She could feel the weight of her breath, shallow and tight, as if the air was thicker inside the train, laced with something she couldn't name. Her eyes darted around the compartment, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The ornate chandeliers swayed lazily, their light flickering like dying stars, casting strange reflections on the polished brass fixtures. Everything was too perfect, too quiet. And yet she wasn't alone. The sound of a soft chuckle echoed from the far end of the train, low and unsettling. Maggie froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She turned her head sharply, her flashlight useless now in the endless gloom, but the sound had already ceased. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a new message. "Do you hear them?" Confusion and fear twisted inside her. She wasn't sure if the message was meant for her, but she knew one thing for sure. Someone or something was watching her. The train had not stopped at Ravenwood Station. It had taken her, and she didn't know where it was going. Another message flashed on her phone. This one was a single sentence. "They are all passengers too." Maggie's eyes narrowed. She tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread crawling up her spine. She looked around for anyone, anything, but the train remained empty. The seats, elegant and well-kept, didn't belong to anyone. At least not anyone she could see. The clattering of the train on the tracks was the only noise, save for the occasional whisper that seemed to float in from nowhere. Then the air shifted. It was subtle at first, like a breath of wind that hadn't quite settled. But as the train moved deeper into the abyss, something stirred in the darkness outside the window. Figures. Shadows, hunched and moving along the tracks, keeping pace with the train, reaching out as if drawn to it. Maggie's breath hitched as she leaned closer to the window, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Her flashlight beam danced across the glass, illuminating the scene outside, but the shadows only seemed to grow larger, more defined, the closer they came. Suddenly, the train lurched again, and the lights inside flickered wildly. For a moment, the entire carriage plunged into darkness. In the silence, Maggie heard it, a faint rustle behind her, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. She spun around, heart pounding. Her gaze swept the interior. But the presence was undeniable. A chill crawled up her spine, and in the flickering light, Maggie saw something move. Just a flash, a figure that disappeared into the dark corner of the compartment before she could even register its shape. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed yet again. "Stay seated, Maggie. It's too late to run now." Panic surged within her. Maggie stood, her legs unsteady, every instinct telling her to flee, but her feet wouldn't move. She was frozen. The force that had held her in the seat earlier was now pulling her down the aisle, unwillingly guiding her forward, deeper into the train. She reached a door at the end of the car. It was ajar, and beyond it lay another compartment. This one was different. The seats were not velvet, but old, worn leather, and the walls were covered in strange arcane symbols. Runes, perhaps, or something older still. A low voice whispered from behind her again, almost a sigh. "You are passenger now, and so is everyone else on this train." Maggie's blood ran cold. She turned, and standing just inches away was a figure. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes, his features barely distinguishable in the dim light. His lips moved, but the words didn't make sense. No sound came from his mouth, but the message was clear. "You're one of us now." Maggie wanted to scream, to fight, but she was paralyzed. The figure reached out with long, bony fingers, its grip cold and unyielding as it touched her arm. The world outside the train shifted, blurring into a chaotic whirlwind of figures and whispers. And then, just as suddenly, everything went silent. The train had stopped, and Maggie knew in her gut that it had reached its final destination. The moment the train came to a halt, the air inside the carriage grew heavier, thick with a sense of finality that pressed down on Maggie like an invisible weight. The silence that followed the screech of the train's sudden stop was oppressive, as if the entire world had held its breath. The crimson lights flickered once more, casting a sickly glow over the compartment. Every corner of the train seemed to pulse with a strange, unsettling energy, and Maggie felt her chest tighten, her heart racing as her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. The figure, the gaunt man, still stood before her, his hollow eyes boring into hers with an intensity that felt like it could strip her bare, leave her exposed to the very marrow of her being. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to make Maggie's blood run cold. His outstretched fingers trembled ever so slightly, and for a moment, Maggie thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, an emotion, maybe fear or something darker, something older. Then, as if in response to an unspoken command, the air in the compartment shifted. The temperature plummeted, the warmth of her breath now visible in the chilling atmosphere. The very walls of the train seemed to pulse in rhythm with the eerie silence that had settled over everything. Maggie's mind screamed for her to leave, but her legs refused to move, as though they were bound by an unseen force. The grip on her arm tightened, its coldness seeping through her skin and making her feel as though she were being drained of warmth, of life itself. Her phone buzzed again, but this time the screen displayed something new. A location. Ravenwood Station, 3:13 a.m. The message blinked at her like a warning, the time far too familiar. She could feel the weight of it, the connection to everything that had led her here. This wasn't just any train, it was a trap, a prison built from whispers and shadows, and it had drawn her in with the promise of answers. But now, standing in the dim glow of the train, Maggie realized she hadn't been brought here to uncover the truth. She had been brought here to become a part of the story, a part of something much larger, much darker than she could ever have imagined. The gaunt figure stepped closer, his face now inches from hers, his breath like the chill of the grave. He opened his mouth, but the words that came out were barely audible, a rasping whisper that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. The journey has only begun, passenger, and we are waiting. The words settled into the thick air, their weight pressing down on Maggie's chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to scream, to run, but the words held her in place, rooted to the spot as though the train itself had taken hold of her. The gaunt man's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too inhuman. Before she could react, the air around her shimmered, as if the very fabric of reality was folding in on itself. The train, once still, began to move again, slowly, with an unnatural smoothness that was at odds with the sense of unease that seemed to fill every inch of space. The walls of the compartment seemed to stretch and distort, bending in impossible angles, as though the train were no longer confined to the tracks at all. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, as though it too was warping, shifting with each passing moment. The gaunt man's grip loosened, but he didn't step back. Instead, he gestured toward the window. Maggie turned her gaze, her stomach sinking as she looked out. The world outside had changed. Gone were the familiar landscapes of the countryside, the distant hills and quiet forests that had once surrounded Ravenwood. Now there was nothing but swirling darkness, an endless void that seemed to consume everything in its path. Shapes, terrible, inhuman shapes, moved just beyond the train's windows, their distorted figures casting long shadows across the train's sleek surface. The train's speed picked up, its motion now a frantic blur. Maggie's hands gripped the seat beneath her, but it was no use. She felt as though she were being pulled into the vortex outside, dragged into the same endless night that surrounded them. The shadows outside pressed closer, and for a fleeting moment, Maggie saw something. A face, gaunt and hollow-eyed, staring back at her through the window. Its mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but its eyes were filled with something she couldn't name. Something ancient. Something hungry. Suddenly, the train lurched again, its motion jerking Maggie out of her thoughts. The compartment lights flickered once more, and this time they went out completely. Darkness swallowed her whole. She could hear the sound of soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer to her. The silence was so thick, so suffocating, that Maggie could almost hear the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She strained her eyes, hoping for even the smallest glimmer of light, but there was nothing. The train had become a vessel of pure, unyielding darkness, and she was trapped within it. The voice, low but now unmistakably familiar, whispered again right beside her ear. "You should have stayed in Ravenwood." Maggie spun around, her eyes wide, her breath catching in her throat. There was no one there, but the words had been so close, so real. And then, from the corner of her vision, something moved. A figure, just a shadow at first, emerged from the darkness, walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. Maggie tried to scream, to move, but she was frozen in place. The shadow grew larger, its form becoming clearer until she could see it. It was a woman, draped in tattered, ancient clothing, her face hidden beneath a hood. Her presence was almost too much to bear, as if the very essence of despair radiated from her. She moved silently, her footsteps barely making a sound against the cold floor of the train. And then she spoke, her voice hollow and distant, as if it came from the depths of the abyss itself. "You're here to stay, passenger. There's no leaving this place." Maggie's pulse thundered in her ears as the woman in the hood stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, suffocating. The air around them seemed to thicken, every breath now a struggle, as if the very essence of the train were alive and feeding on her fear. The woman's eyes were hidden in shadow, but the emptiness of her gaze felt like a cold, uncaring abyss. Maggie could almost feel her thoughts unraveling, torn apart by the strange, foreign presence before her. "You're not the first," the woman's voice whispered, a low, mournful sound that seemed to reverberate through Maggie's very soul. "And you won't be the last." Maggie tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her tongue heavy. The words she wanted to say were trapped, locked away in a prison of terror that had taken hold of her body. The woman's voice echoed in her mind, a haunting lullaby that filled the empty spaces between her thoughts. "Who are you?" Maggie finally managed to croak, her voice cracking. The question felt insignificant, lost in the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to her like a second skin. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she raised her hand, the bony fingers curling into a fist, and pointed toward the window. Maggie followed her gaze, but what she saw made her heart stop. Outside the train, the darkness was now broken only by the faintest glow, flickering lights, distant and fleeting like ghosts in the mist. The landscape, or what Maggie could make of it, seemed to warp and shift, as though the very fabric of reality was bending. The shapes outside the window were no longer just shadows. They were figures, hundreds, thousands, all reaching for the train, their hands outstretched, faces distorted in silent screams. The woman's voice, calm and cold, broke through the silence again. "The others, the ones who didn't make it, they're still here waiting just like you?" Maggie's stomach twisted, nausea threatening to overtake her. The others? Who were they? And how long had they been trapped here, in this cursed journey that never seemed to end? She couldn't tear her eyes away from the window. The figures outside weren't just reaching out, they were trying to board the train, to pull themselves onto the carriage. She saw their faces twisted in agony, their eyes wide and pleading, as though they were begging Maggie to understand. Their hands scraped against the glass, leaving trails of dark, viscous fluid. One figure, a man with hollow eyes, pressed his face against the window, his mouth opening wide in a silent scream that Maggie could hear in her mind. Her skin crawled as she stumbled back, her body colliding with the cold, velvet seat behind her. She spun around, heart racing, but the train seemed to be changing, shifting around her, its layout now unfamiliar, its walls closing in. The train had become a labyrinth, twisting corridors leading to nowhere, darkened doors opening to more darkened rooms. The woman in the hood had disappeared, leaving Maggie alone in the suffocating silence. But she could still hear the whispers, soft at first but growing louder. They were calling her name. Maggie? The voice was unmistakable, her own name, spoken in 1,000 different tones, as though it were being repeated by 100 different mouths, all coming from the shadows. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet refused to move. It was as though the very train had trapped her, its invisible tendrils pulling her deeper into the heart of its dark, twisted heart. What is this place? She thought desperately. Where is the train taking me? Her phone buzzed again, its screen flickering violently. She pulled it out, her hands shaking uncontrollably. This time the message wasn't static, it was clear. Welcome to the forgotten journey. There is no escape. Only those who belong here may leave. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Belong? What did that mean? She wasn't supposed to be here. She was just a journalist. She had come to uncover the truth. But now, standing in the heart of this otherworldly train, it was clear the truth was something far darker than she had ever imagined. A faint light appeared down the corridor, just a flicker at first, like a candle in the dark. Maggie's eyes locked onto it, her instinct to survive kicking in. She had to find a way out. She didn't care where it led as long as it was somewhere away from this nightmare. Taking a deep breath, she forced her legs to move, each step heavier than the last, the walls seeming to pulse with an eerie rhythm, like the heartbeat of the train itself. She approached the light, the only beacon in the growing darkness, until she reached the door at the end of the hallway. The handle was cold, unnaturally so, and when she touched it, a jolt of cold shot up her arm as if the train itself had rejected her. But she didn't stop. She twisted the handle, pushing the door open, and stepped into the unknown. The light inside was blinding at first, but as her eyes adjusted, Maggie realized that what lay ahead was not a room at all. It was a platform. A platform that mirrored Ravenwood Station, the very station she had arrived at, but this one was different. The air was thick with the scent of decay. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, the wood splintered and rotting. The platform was deserted, no sign of life anywhere, just endless tracks leading into the void. In the distance, the sound of a train whistle echoed, faint but unmistakable. And then, slowly from the darkness ahead, Maggie saw it, another train. Sleek and black, just like the one she had boarded, but this time it wasn't moving. It was waiting for her. Maggie stood frozen, the platform before her stretching out into an inky abyss. The air was thick with a dense fog that seemed to pulse with the weight of lost memories. The distant train, sleek and black like the one she had first boarded, sat motionless on the tracks, its windows as dark and impenetrable as a void. It was waiting as if the train itself had sensed her presence, drawn to her like a magnet. She swallowed hard, the oppressive silence around her making it impossible to breathe. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to return to the darkened corridors of the cursed train she had just left. But something deep within her, urged her forward toward the waiting vessel that promised only more darkness, more questions. The whistle blew again, faint but unmistakable, and Maggie's heart skipped a beat. The sound was so close now, so real, yet it seemed to come from all around her, echoing off the warped walls of the station. It was as though the train was alive, breathing, waiting for her to step aboard. The cold grip of fear wrapped tighter around her chest as she approached the waiting train. The platform seemed to stretch further with each step she took, the fog thickening, making it harder to see. The further she walked, the quieter everything became, until it felt like the world had disappeared entirely. There was only the sound of her own footsteps, the beating of her heart, and the distant, haunting whistle that seemed to follow her every movement. She reached the train, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The doors stood open, inviting her in. The inside of the train was just as dark and forbidding as the first. Yet it seemed different somehow, as though this place was older, more ancient than anything she had encountered. The interior was impossibly quiet, too quiet as if the train had never moved, had never carried a single soul. A sudden thought gripped Maggie like a vice. Why were there no other passengers? Where were all the people who had once ridden this train, and where were the others that the woman in the hood had mentioned? The idea of walking into that empty, suffocating space seemed insane, but a powerful force was pulling her toward it, like an invisible hand guiding her to her fate. She took a step inside. The doors closed behind her with a finality that sent a chill down her spine. The sound was soft, but it felt like a thunderclap in her ears. The train had trapped her, and it wasn't going to let her leave. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, something that smelled like mold, rust, and old memories. The velvet seats, once regal and inviting, were now cracked and torn, their dark fabric stained with something Maggie couldn't bear to look at. The chandeliers above her swayed gently, though there was no breeze, no movement, just the oppressive silence that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Then she saw it. At the far end of the train, behind a set of heavy curtains, something stirred. A shadow. At first, it seemed to be a trick of the light, but as Maggie's eyes adjusted, she saw it clearly, a figure standing still watching her. The figure was tall, gaunt, and shrouded in darkness, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows that seemed to wrap around it like a cloak. Her heart stopped as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. It didn't speak, but its presence was enough to send an ice-cold shiver through Maggie's body. She couldn't move. Her legs refused to obey her, as if the train itself was holding her in place. The figure's face emerged from the shadows, its features distorted, twisted, almost skeletal. Its eyes were dark voids, empty and devoid of any life, but they glimmered with a terrible, knowing awareness. And then it spoke. "You've come," it said, its voice low and hollow, like the wind howling through an abandoned tomb. "You've come to join us." Maggie stumbled back, her pulse racing. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. She was trapped, caught in the web of this nightmare with no escape in sight. The figure's voice echoed in her mind, its words wrapping around her thoughts like tendrils of darkness. "No one ever leaves," it whispered, its breath cold against her ear. "Not unless they belong." The train suddenly lurched, its motion jerking Maggie forward, and the figure's hand shot out, grabbing her arm with inhuman strength. Maggie cried out, but her voice was swallowed by the overwhelming silence that followed. She tried to break free, but the grip tightened, pulling her closer to the darkened figure. And then, as if in response to an unseen command, the train began to move. Slowly at first, the wheels grinding against the track, but it quickly gained speed, its motion smooth and unnaturally quiet. The outside world was now nothing more than a blur of shifting shadows, the landscape warping and twisting as the train raced through a realm that didn't belong to the living. Maggie looked around desperately, her gaze darting from one dark corner of the train to another. She was no longer alone. The other passengers, those who had come before her, were now visible, standing at the end of the train, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They were dressed in tattered clothes, their faces gaunt and hollow, their movements stiff and unnatural. Each one of them seemed to be waiting for something, watching her, as though they were all part of a grim procession. But Maggie knew one thing for certain now. The train wasn't just taking her to another place, it was taking her to another time, to a fate that had already been sealed. She wasn't just a passenger. She was part of the journey, a journey that never ended, one that kept returning to the same station, the same waiting train. The figure holding her arm leaned in close, its cold breath brushing against her skin. "Welcome to the end, passenger." The words hung in the air, a chilling whisper that made Maggie's skin crawl. "Welcome to the end, passenger." The figure's voice was cold, as though it came from a place where time and warmth had long ceased to exist. The grip on her arm tightened, an iron fist pulling her closer, and the world around her seemed to shift, the train groaning as though it too was awakening to some unseen force. Maggie's mind raced. The end? What did it mean? The end of what? Her heart hammered in her chest, but there was no escape, no place to run. The train, the figure, the passengers, they were all part of this unholy, unending journey. Maggie felt it now, the truth that had been hiding behind the shadows. The other passengers, all of them standing silent in the dim light, seemed to be watching her with detached interest. Their hollow eyes bore into her soul, but there was no compassion, no recognition, just a cold, terrifying emptiness. They weren't alive. Maggie knew that with a sickening certainty. They had once been like her, perhaps, but now they were just echoes of what they had been. Lost souls, trapped in this never-ending train ride. The train lurched again, this time with more force. Maggie stumbled, her feet struggling to find solid ground as the car rocked violently. The windows were black, reflecting nothing but the darkness that pressed in from all sides. The train was no longer moving through any recognizable landscape. It was moving through a void, a place where time and space no longer held meaning. The track beneath them seemed endless, stretching far beyond the horizon, disappearing into a blackness that seemed to devour everything it touched. Where are we going? Maggie finally managed to choke out, her voice shaky, barely a whisper in the overwhelming silence. The figure that held her arm didn't respond at first. It simply tilted its head slightly, the motion eerily mechanical, as if it were studying her. "You know," it said slowly, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "The journey doesn't have a destination. It never does." The figure released her arm, its bony fingers slipping away like a shadow. Maggie staggered back, confusion and terror mixing in her chest. But why me?" she demanded, her breath coming in frantic gasps. "Why am I here?" The figure's eyes, or rather, the voids where eyes should have been, narrowed. "You didn't choose it, but you're here all the same." Maggie's legs weakened, and she collapsed into one of the empty seats, her mind spiraling. She was starting to understand. This wasn't just some haunted train, it was a purgatory, a prison for souls who had failed to escape their pasts. The ones who belonged here didn't get to choose. They were drawn in just like she had been. The voices, the whispers, the cold, dark forces that seemed to guide her every move, these were all pieces of a puzzle that she had yet to fully understand. But one thing was clear now. If she didn't figure out a way to break the cycle, she would become just like them, one of the lost souls waiting for the journey to end. And from what she had seen, that end was nothing but an endless loop of despair. Maggie's mind whirled as she looked at the passengers once more. There had to be something she was missing, some clue, some way out. As her gaze scanned the train car, she noticed something she hadn't before. The walls, although faded and decaying, were covered in strange, cryptic markings. Symbols that seemed to shift and change, flickering in and out of her line of sight. They weren't just random scratches. They were deliberate, carved into the very fabric of the train. And among them, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A name. Her name. It was etched into the wall near the door, scrawled in what looked like old rust-colored ink. Maggie Hart, it read, and below it, the same chilling word that had haunted her from the moment she had stepped on board: passenger. A surge of panic rose in her chest, but then something else crept in. A flicker of realization. No one was truly a passenger here. No one had ever been. Her gaze snapped to the window once more. The blackness outside hadn't changed. It was the same endless void. But now she could see something else, something faint but unmistakable, a flickering light. It was so distant, so far away, yet it seemed to beckon her, calling her toward it. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the way out? Or was it just another illusion, another cruel game the train was playing with her mind? She couldn't be sure, but she knew one thing. If she didn't act now, she would never have another chance. She had to reach that light. She had to find the truth, the key that would set her free from this nightmare. Maggie rose from her seat, her legs shaking, but her resolve hardening. The whispers started again, louder this time, the voices swirling around her like 1,000 angry bees. "You can't leave," they hissed. "You belong here. Forever." Ignoring them, she stumbled toward the door at the end of the car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The train seemed to fight her every step. The walls closed in, the darkness pressing against her, the air growing thick and suffocating. But she wouldn't stop. Not now. When she reached the door, she hesitated only for a moment. Her hand gripped the handle and she yanked it open with all her strength. The moment she stepped through, the train car fell away. The air shifted, and for the first time since she had boarded the train, she felt the ground beneath her feet. The light outside wasn't just a flicker. It was a blazing, searing light that cut through the darkness, burning away the shadows that had once seemed so impossible to escape. She stepped into the light. Maggie's heart thundered in her chest as she stood at the edge of the train's doorway, staring into the impenetrable darkness that stretched out before her. The light, that faint glimmer she had seen outside, was no longer a distant hope. It was right there, only a few steps away. But as she reached for the handle of the door, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices rising into a cacophony of desperate, pleading cries. "You can't leave. You don't belong there. You'll never escape." The air around her grew thick, suffocating, pressing against her chest as if the train itself were trying to hold her in place. The voices were everywhere now, swirling around her like a storm, the words growing more frantic, more desperate. Maggie's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she clutched the door frame. She could feel the cold fingers of fear tightening around her throat, squeezing, choking the very life from her. But she refused to give in. She had to leave. She had to find a way out. The whispers turned into screams. Faces appeared in the darkness, distorted and twisted, eyes wide with terror. They reached out for her, clawing at the edges of the train, but they were too far away to touch her. Yet their presence was undeniable, like a heavy weight pressing down on her very soul. She could feel their cold, dead eyes on her, could feel their silent judgment. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with an explosive force, knocking Maggie back against the wall. She cried out in shock, her heart racing. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the train jerked violently, throwing her to the floor. The sound of the wheels screeching on the tracks filled the air, louder now, more frantic, as if the train was speeding up, plunging deeper into the abyss. Maggie scrambled to her feet, her head spinning as the world around her spun. The flickering light from outside was now completely obscured, swallowed by the blackness that surrounded her. Panic surged through her, her thoughts jumbled, her body trembling with the weight of the overwhelming darkness. "You can't escape," a voice whispered again, this time right in her ear, so close she could feel the cold breath against her skin. "You belong here." Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into one of the velvet chairs, her head in her hands. The weight of it all, this place, these people, the endless train ride, was too much. She wanted to scream, wanted to claw at the walls and tear the train apart to escape. But she knew that would do nothing. The train was alive. The darkness was alive. A cold hand rested on her shoulder. She spun around, heart leaping into her throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the endless rows of empty seats, the dark figures of the passengers watching her with hollow eyes, waiting for something. For what? Maggie didn't know. She couldn't understand. But then something shifted. A low, guttural rumble vibrated through the floor beneath her feet, shaking the entire train. The air thickened again, heavy with an oppressive pressure that made her chest feel as though it were being crushed. The passengers, the souls trapped in the train, started to move. They rose from their seats, their motions slow, stiff, as though their bodies were being controlled by an unseen force. Maggie stood, her legs shaking beneath her, her mind clouded with terror. She backed away, her eyes darting around the train car, trying to make sense of what was happening. The passengers began to advance, moving in unison, their footsteps echoing through the silence, their eyes fixed on her. It was as if they had all been waiting for something, and now that something had arrived. "She is here." The voice echoed in her mind, deep and resonant, reverberating through every fiber of her being. She gasped, her hand clutching the edge of a seat for support. Her breath quickened as the figure from before, the one who had first spoken to her, emerged from the shadows at the far end of the car. The figure was taller now, its features even more grotesque, its face a twisted mask of pain and sorrow. "You shouldn't have come here, Maggie Hart," it intoned, its voice low and rumbling like the sound of a storm brewing in the distance. "But now that you have, there is no turning back." Maggie's chest tightened. She could feel her heart pounding, her breath shallow. The walls of the train seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing deeper, the space becoming smaller, more suffocating. She had to get out, had to find the door, the light, anything that would lead her away from this nightmare. But the passengers were closing in on her, their hollow eyes locked on hers, their movements synchronized like puppets on strings. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the floor, her hands grasping for any support. The train lurched again, this time with more force, and Maggie was thrown forward, her body crashing into the cold floor. She gasped for air, her head spinning, her vision blurring as the world seemed to tilt around her. The train was moving faster now, the screeching of the wheels on the tracks growing deafening, the walls of the train warping and distorting, twisting in ways that made her feel as if she were falling into a vortex of madness. The train was alive, and it was taking her deeper into the abyss. Maggie pushed herself up, her body weak, her muscles aching from the effort. She couldn't stop. Not now. She had to keep moving. Her eyes flicked to the door at the far end of the car, the door that had once been her hope for escape. It was still there, but it seemed farther away than ever, swallowed by the ever-growing darkness. The passengers were upon her now, their cold, dead hands reaching for her, their faces contorted in expressions of pain and longing. One of them grabbed her arm, its grip like ice, and pulled her back toward the center of the car. Maggie fought, kicking and screaming, but her strength was fading, the cold hands of the train pulling her in, dragging her deeper into the void. And then, just as she thought she might be lost forever, the lights flickered. For the briefest moment, everything stopped. The passengers froze, their eyes locked on her, their faces unreadable. The rumbling of the train ceased. The darkness was gone, replaced by a blinding, searing light that seemed to pour from the ceiling, bathing the entire car in a warm glow. The figures, those lost souls, paused, and Maggie felt the pressure around her chest lift, if only for a moment. In that instant, Maggie knew. She had to act now, before the light vanished, before the train consumed her completely. With one last burst of strength, she pulled free from the cold grasp of the soul that held her. She darted for the door, her legs trembling beneath her, her breath ragged as she reached for the handle. But before she could touch it, a voice rang out, deep and powerful, shaking the very foundation of the train. "You can't leave, Maggie Hart. The journey has only just begun." The door slammed shut before she could reach it. The light flickered once more, and the darkness closed in around her, pulling her back into the endless void. Maggie's world was a blur of cold shadows and suffocating silence. The train had stopped moving, but she could still feel the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in on her from every angle. Her heart raced, thumping loudly in her ears as she stumbled through the dimly lit train car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air smelled of mildew and old wood, a musty scent that seemed to hang in the air like a ghost, lingering long after its source had vanished. The train had become her prison, and the passengers, those lost souls who moved with eerie precision, were its guards. But Maggie knew one thing for certain now: she couldn't give in. She couldn't let the darkness consume her. She had to find a way out, even if it meant facing whatever horrors the train held in its depths. The door was still closed, but now there was something different, something far worse. The walls around her seemed to stretch and groan, shifting as if they were alive. The train car twisted, warping in unnatural angles, the metal creaking under the strain of something unseen. The once comforting darkness that had enveloped her felt heavier now, like it had taken on a life of its own, its presence thick and suffocating. Then, as if in answer to her thoughts, the train car groaned, and a low hum reverberated through the walls. It started slowly, faint at first, but it grew steadily louder, vibrating through the floor and up her spine. It was a sound that was both mechanical and alive, as if the train itself were trying to speak, to make its presence known. "You shouldn't have come," a voice said, smooth and cold, like ice running through her veins. Maggie froze. It was the same voice, the one that had spoken to her before. But now it was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was deeper, more sinister, and it echoed through the air like a warning. The walls of the train car shifted once more, and a dark figure appeared at the far end of the aisle, its silhouette framed by the faint, flickering light. Maggie's breath hitched in her throat, and she stepped back, her feet stumbling over the uneven floor. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there watching her, its presence like a shadow that threatened to swallow her whole. "You can't run from me," the voice continued, growing louder, more menacing. "You can never leave." Maggie's heart thundered in her chest as the figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its body cloaked in shadows, the edges of its figure flickering in and out of existence like a bad signal on an old TV. As it moved, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with each step it took. Maggie's breath fogged in front of her, but it wasn't just the chill that made her shiver, it was the overwhelming sense of dread that coiled around her like a tightening noose. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her body felt frozen, her legs unwilling to move. It was as if the very essence of fear had paralyzed her, rendering her powerless. Her flashlight flickered one last time before dying, leaving her in complete darkness. She couldn't see the figure now, but she could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing down on her. The air was thick with the promise of something terrible, something ancient. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the car, and Maggie's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't the same anymore. It had taken on a different tone, a twisted mockery of the one that had first spoken to her. It was like the laughter of a creature that had been waiting, biding its time for an eternity, and now its time had come. "You're not meant to leave," the voice rasped. "The train is where you belong." Maggie's pulse raced as she struggled to breathe. The darkness seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in from all sides, the train vibrating beneath her feet as if it were alive, alive and hungry. The air was thick with something foul, something that made her stomach churn. And then, as the figure moved toward her, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The sound of the train's doors slowly creaking open. It was a sound she had been waiting for, hoping for, but now it filled her with dread. The doors opened, revealing only the endless blackness outside. It was as if the abyss itself had opened before her, beckoning her into its void. "Go ahead," the voice whispered, its tone now soft, seductive. "Step into the darkness. It's where you were always meant to be." Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, to fight back. But her body refused to obey. It was as if the train, the shadows, the very darkness itself had claimed her. She was paralyzed, trapped within the train's grasp. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, faster than she could react. It was upon her in an instant, its cold hands gripping her arms, pulling her toward the open door. Maggie fought back, her nails scratching against the cold metal, her voice hoarse from the scream that had lodged in her throat. But the figure was too strong, its grip unyielding. And then, just as the darkness began to swallow her whole, Maggie's mind flashed with a memory of the old train schedule, the one she had seen earlier, with the cryptic times and destinations. The word passenger had been written in blood. She had thought it was a warning, but now she realized it was something worse. The train wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a prison, a trap for those who had been chosen. Before she could react, the figure shoved her through the open door. The darkness outside was endless. There was no ground, no sky, just a void stretching out in every direction, consuming everything it touched. Maggie screamed as she was pulled into the abyss, her body weightless, her arms flailing. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the shadowy figure's grin, an expression of twisted satisfaction, as if it had won. And then there was nothing. No sound, no light, just a void. Silver Creek was a city that seemed to live in the shadow of its own history. A place where the past never truly left, and the present could barely move without being haunted by its ghosts. Tucked between dense forests and winding rivers, it was a picturesque town during the day, quaint cobblestone streets, historic buildings, and a riverbank that shimmered in the sunlight. But once the sun set, Silver Creek transformed. The fog rolled in from the river, and the streets grew silent, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Among the many stories that floated around Silver Creek, there was one that chilled even the bravest hearts. It was a story of a woman named Eleanor West, who had vanished without a trace over 70 years ago. Eleanor had been a prominent figure in the town, the daughter of the local doctor. She was beloved by all who knew her, kind, charitable, and always there for anyone in need. But one fateful evening, she disappeared. No one saw her leave, and there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished from existence. Despite extensive searches, no trace of Eleanor was ever found. Some whispered that she had run away, others believed foul play had been involved, but the truth remained a mystery. As years passed, the town slowly moved on. But Eleanor's disappearance never truly left. It became a part of Silver Creek's dark history, an enigma that lingered in the minds of its residents. And then the strange occurrences began. It started with the clock tower. It had stood proudly in the center of the town for over a century, its bells ringing on the hour every hour. But one night, the clock struck 13. The strange sound echoed through the empty streets, and those who were awake at the time reported hearing footsteps in the distance. Footsteps that didn't seem to belong to anyone. Those who ventured near the tower claimed to feel a cold presence, a chill that seemed to seep into their very bones. Some even claimed to have seen a figure standing at the top of the tower, a pale woman in white staring down at the town below. As the months passed, other strange happenings followed. The old church at the edge of town, which had been abandoned for years, was said to have lights flickering inside during the dead of night. People reported hearing soft voices, murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. One brave soul, a young man named Samuel, decided to investigate. He was known for his skepticism, always dismissing the town's ghost stories as mere superstition. But after one visit to the church, he never spoke again. He was found wandering the streets, disoriented, his eyes wide with terror. He claimed to have seen Eleanor's ghost in the church, her pale face, her sad, empty eyes. But he couldn't remember what had happened after that. The whispers grew louder, and the fear began to spread. People began locking their doors earlier in the evening, and the once thriving town square grew emptier as night fell. Those who remained after dark reported hearing faint singing on the wind, the soft sound of a lullaby carried by the breeze. It was always the same song, a haunting melody that no one could place, but everyone seemed to recognize. The lullaby would float through the streets and settle over the town like a shroud, suffocating and cold. And always there was the sense that someone was watching, waiting. But the most chilling event of all occurred one autumn evening, when the full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the town. A group of locals, desperate to get to the bottom of the mystery, decided to visit the old clock tower. They had heard rumors that Eleanor's ghost still roamed the tower, trapped in time, cursed to walk its halls for all eternity. Armed with nothing but flashlights in their nerves, they made their way up the narrow staircase to the top of the tower. The air grew colder the higher they climbed. The stone steps felt damp underfoot, and the smell of decay grew stronger with every step. When they finally reached the top, they found the clock's face cracked, its hands frozen in place. The town below was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. It was then that they heard it, soft, faint at first, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps on the stairs below. The group turned toward the sound, their hearts racing in their chests. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Suddenly, the door to the clock tower opened with a loud creak. A figure stepped into the light, a woman in a long, flowing white dress. Her face was obscured by shadows, but they could see her eyes, deep, hollow, and filled with sorrow. The group froze, unable to move, their eyes locked on her. The woman raised her hand, her pale fingers twitching as if beckoning them. And then, in a voice that echoed through the tower, she spoke. You should not have come." The words sent a shiver down their spines, and one by one the group turned and fled down the stairs, leaving the tower behind. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of their homes, but the fear had already taken hold. From that night onward, no one dared approach the tower again. The next morning, when the town awoke, the clock tower's hands had begun to move again, but they were no longer stuck at the hour. They ticked, but they ticked backward. Each passing second was a step further back in time, and no one could understand how or why. Days turned into weeks, and the town grew quieter. The singing, the footsteps, and the strange occurrences continued, but now there was a new sense of dread. People started to leave, unable to shake the feeling that Silver Creek itself was dying, its history unraveling as its ghosts clawed their way into the present. But for one resident, Emma Winters, there was no escaping the truth. She had grown up in Silver Creek, and her family had lived there for generations. One evening, when the moon was full, Emma found herself standing in front of the old church. The singing was louder now, and she could hear the lullaby clearly in her mind. She had to know the truth. She entered the church, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The air was thick with dust, and the candles flickered as if disturbed by an unseen hand. In the back of the church, Emma found what she had been looking for. A hidden room, a small door that led beneath the church. As she descended into the darkness, she felt her heartbeat quicken. The room was cold, and the walls were covered in strange markings. And in the center of the room, lying on a stone altar, was an old, cracked mirror. As Emma approached, she saw someone reflected in the glass. A woman's face, pale and sorrowful, her eyes wide with terror. Emma reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the mirror, and instantly, the room was filled with a blinding light. The lullaby played louder now, an agonizing sound that seemed to tear through her very soul. When the light faded, Emma was no longer in the church. She was standing in the middle of Silver Creek, but everything was different. The town was older, the buildings decayed and falling apart. She looked down at her hands, her skin was old and wrinkled. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. She had crossed over into the past, into the time when Eleanor had vanished. And in the distance, she saw the figure of a woman in white, walking toward her with hollow eyes, whispering her name. "Welcome home, Emma." As the first rays of dawn pierced through the dense fog that had rolled in from the river, the town of Silver Creek seemed to awaken from an unsettling slumber. The streets were still silent, save for the distant murmur of the river, as if the town itself was holding its breath. But within the homes, behind closed doors, fear was quietly growing. Lydia Collins, a young woman who had recently moved back to Silver Creek after years away, stood at the window of her old family home. She had grown up here, but the town that greeted her now felt different, heavier, as though the air itself was thick with untold secrets. She had come back to Silver Creek for a fresh start, a new job, and to reconnect with the small-town life she had once cherished. But something was wrong. Something was lurking just beyond her understanding. The first sign had been the dreams. Every night since her arrival, Lydia had been haunted by vivid, disturbing dreams of a woman in white, standing by the riverbank, her face obscured by shadows. The woman would call to her, whispering her name in a voice that echoed with sorrow. And every time Lydia tried to approach, the woman would vanish, leaving behind only an overwhelming sense of grief. But it wasn't just the dreams that troubled her. It was the strange feeling of being watched. The sensation that someone, or something, was lurking just beyond her line of sight, waiting, observing her every move. Lydia couldn't shake the feeling no matter how hard she tried. And last night, something had happened that shattered any sense of safety she still clung to. She had gone out for a walk in the evening, hoping to clear her head. The streets of Silver Creek were always quiet at night, the kind of quiet that made it easy to lose track of time, to feel like you were the only person left in the world. But as she walked past the old clock tower, she had heard it. A voice, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from the tower. Lydia had stopped, her heart racing, and turned to look. The sound was soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Lydia," the voice called her name, sending a chill down her spine. She looked around, but there was no one in sight. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that twisted and danced as if they had a life of their own. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the voice faded, leaving only the oppressive silence. Shaken, Lydia had hurried back to her house, but the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the thought that the voice was connected to the woman in her dreams. But who was she? Why was she calling her name? And why did Lydia feel so certain that something had been awakened in Silver Creek? It wasn't until the next morning that Lydia met someone who might have the answers she was desperately searching for. Her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had lived in Silver Creek her entire life, was waiting for her on the porch. Mrs. Henderson had always been a bit of a mystery, her gray eyes sharp and full of secrets that Lydia suspected she was unwilling to share. But today there was something different about the old woman. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small, weathered book. "Lydia, dear, we need to talk," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "I've been meaning to speak with you. It's about the woman in white. You've seen her, haven't you?" Lydia's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't told anyone about the woman in her dreams, nor the voice from the night before. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Henderson's eyes darkened, and she glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It's not just a dream, Lydia. The woman you've seen, the woman in white, is no ordinary ghost. She is Eleanor West, the girl who disappeared over 70 years ago. And I'm afraid her spirit has been awakened again. The town is in danger." Lydia felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. "But why? Why now? Why me?" Mrs. Henderson set the book down on the porch table and opened it to a faded, yellowed page. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings, and Lydia felt a shiver run down her spine as her eyes scanned the text. "This book," Mrs. Henderson continued, "was passed down through generations in my family. It's the journal of one of the town's founding families, and it holds the key to Eleanor's disappearance. There's a curse on this town, Lydia, one that was placed long before any of us were born." Lydia's mind raced. A curse? Eleanor's disappearance had always been a mystery, but this? She had to know more. What curse? What happened to Eleanor? Mrs. Henderson sighed deeply. "It's a long story, but the short of it is this. Eleanor was not meant to leave. She was chosen by the town's founders to play a crucial role in their plans. But she rebelled, tried to run away. And so they took her, trapped her in the very town she had once loved. But her spirit didn't rest. It never did." Lydia felt a cold sweat forming on her brow. "So what does this mean for me? Why am I being involved?" Mrs. Henderson's gaze softened, but the worry in her eyes remained. "Eleanor's spirit has been trapped in the town for all these years, but she's growing restless. The curse, you see, is tied to the very land that Silver Creek was built upon. And now, with the arrival of someone like you, someone with a connection to the past, her spirit is reaching out. She wants to be free, Lydia. But to do so, she needs someone to take her place." Lydia felt her breath catch in her throat. "You mean, she wants me to replace her? To disappear like she did?" Mrs. Henderson nodded solemnly. "Yes, and the longer you stay, the stronger her grip will become. She will try to draw you in to make you her replacement. And once that happens, you'll never leave Silver Creek." Fear coursed through Lydia's veins as she struggled to understand what Mrs. Henderson was telling her. Eleanor's spirit was reaching out to her, and it was only a matter of time before she tried to pull her into the same fate. But how could she escape something like this? How could she fight an ancient curse that seemed to control the very town she had once called home? Just then, the wind picked up, and the faint sound of a lullaby, the same haunting melody that had echoed in Lydia's dreams, drifted across the street. Lydia turned toward the source, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was growing louder, and a chill swept over her. It was happening again. The woman in white was calling to her. Lydia stood frozen on the porch, her eyes locked on the eerie wind that tugged at the trees, as though urging them to whisper secrets they had kept for decades. Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in her mind, each one sinking deeper into her soul, leaving behind an undeniable sense of dread. Eleanor West, the woman in white, hadn't just vanished. She had been trapped and snared by a curse that seemed to tie the town of Silver Creek to an ancient, unspoken pact. The lullaby continued to grow louder, the haunting melody drifting on the wind like a siren's call. Lydia could feel the pull of it deep in her chest, a strange, magnetic force that made her pulse race with both fear and curiosity. It was as though the song was meant for her, each note like a thread weaving its way into her very bones. "Mrs. Henderson," Lydia whispered, her voice shaky, "what do I do? How do I stop it? How do I stop Eleanor?" Mrs. Henderson's face hardened, a sorrowful understanding clouding her eyes. "You can't stop it," she said quietly. "Not without understanding what happened all those years ago. You need to know the truth. Only then can you free her spirit, or risk becoming part of the curse yourself." Lydia's breath caught in her throat. "But you said, I'm connected to it. I'm the one she's reaching for." "Yes," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice grim. "You're the key. Eleanor's spirit has been dormant for years, but she's awake now. She's calling to you, and soon you'll have to make a choice. Help her find peace, or take her place in the shadows forever? The old woman's words sent a chill down Lydia's spine. She glanced down the street, where the melody seemed to be coming from the old clock tower, its silhouette looming in the distance. That was where it all began, where the whispers had first reached her ears. There was no denying it now. The town, its history, its secrets, they were all real. "I have to go," Lydia said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "I have to understand. I need to know why she's reaching for me." Mrs. Henderson nodded gravely, but before Lydia could move, the old woman's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. "No, Lydia. Don't go there alone. The clock tower is where the town's dark history is buried. It's where the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. The closer you get, the more you'll be drawn in. You won't be able to leave once you're caught in her web." Lydia pulled her wrist free, her mind racing. She didn't know who to trust anymore, but there was something inside her, some undeniable force, pushing her forward. She had to go to the clock tower. She had to find the answers. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Lydia said, not looking back. "But I have to do this." The silence that followed was oppressive, and Lydia could feel Mrs. Henderson's eyes following her every step as she made her way down the street. The air felt colder now, the wind sharper, carrying with it an electric charge that made her hair stand on end. The clock tower was just ahead, its outline barely visible through the mist that had settled in like a heavy blanket. As she approached the tower, the sound of the lullaby became almost deafening. The melody was no longer just a song, it was a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from within her rather than from the wind. Lydia's heart hammered in her chest, but she pressed on, each step heavier than the last. The clock tower stood tall and menacing, its stone walls cracked and worn by time. The doors, which had once been grand and imposing, now hung slightly ajar, as though inviting her inside. Lydia hesitated for a moment, her pulse racing, but the pull of the lullaby was too strong. She stepped inside. The interior of the tower was darker than she had imagined. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. At the far end of the room, the massive clock face loomed, its hands frozen at midnight. The soft sound of ticking was the only thing breaking the oppressive silence, but even that seemed off, out of sync, like something had disturbed the flow of time itself. Lydia moved toward the center of the room, her eyes darting around as the wind outside howled, rattling the windows. The temperature had dropped drastically, and she could see her breath in the air. It felt like she had stepped into another world, one where reality and nightmares collided in a twisted dance. Then she saw it. On the far wall, near the base of the clock, was a painting, a portrait of a woman in white. Her face was obscured by shadow, but the feeling of sorrow emanating from the painting was overwhelming. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. This was her, the woman in white, Eleanor West. Without thinking, Lydia reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of the painting. The moment her skin made contact, a sharp pain shot through her body, causing her to gasp in surprise. The room around her seemed to shift, the walls warping, the floor tilting. The voice returned, louder now, unmistakable. "Lydia, come closer. Help me." The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. The clock face above her began to move, its hands creeping slowly, impossibly, toward midnight. And as they did, Lydia felt a pull in her chest, a force that was dragging her toward the portrait, toward the woman in white. She stumbled back, her heart racing as the room around her seemed to close in. The air grew colder still, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward her, their long, dark fingers reaching for her. Lydia spun around, desperate to escape, but the door she had entered through had vanished, replaced by a wall of inky darkness. "Lydia?" The voice was so close now, almost inside her head. She whirled around, but there was nothing there, just the portrait, the clock, and the oppressive shadows. She was alone. Or was she? Suddenly, the clock struck midnight with a deafening clang, the sound reverberating through the tower, vibrating through Lydia's very bones. And in that moment, the darkness seemed to come alive, swirling around her in a vortex of despair. The last thing Lydia heard before the world went black was the faint, ghostly whisper of a woman in white, her voice soft but full of finality. "You're mine now." Lydia's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she thought she was still dreaming. The world around her was shrouded in darkness, but not the comforting kind of darkness. It was thick, oppressive, as if the very air itself was holding her in place. The strange, cold sensation that had taken root in her chest remained, an unshakable weight that seemed to press her deeper into the shadows. She sat up quickly, panic rising in her throat, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Her hands grasped at the cold stone beneath her, fingers tracing the rough texture of the floor, the chilling sensation making her skin crawl. This wasn't a dream. This was real. The clock tower, loomed overhead, its enormous face still frozen at midnight, the hands now silent as though they were waiting for something. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest, the rhythmic beat echoing in her ears as she struggled to push herself to her feet. Her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if she were moving through molasses. She looked around desperately, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of escape, but everything seemed distorted, like a nightmare caught in the blurry edges of reality. A soft sound broke the silence, a whisper so faint, Lydia almost didn't hear it. But there it was again. It wasn't the voice from before, the one that had called her into the tower. No, this was different. It was familiar. Lydia froze, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes landed on the portrait once more. The woman in white, Eleanor West, stood at the center of the room, her painted eyes staring at Lydia with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The figure in the portrait looked almost lifelike now, her features sharp, her expression one of quiet sorrow. But something was different. The air around the painting shimmered, rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond, as if the woman was trying to break free from the confines of the canvas. She's watching me. Lydia's thoughts raced, and her pulse quickened as she took a hesitant step forward. The shadows in the room seemed to shift with her movement, curling around her like tendrils, pulling her toward the painting. She could feel it, an undeniable force drawing her in. She had to get closer. She had to understand. With each step she took, the voice became clearer, more distinct, no longer a whisper but a gentle, pleading call. Lydia, it murmured, soft but filled with an almost desperate yearning. Come closer. She didn't want to move. Her body screamed at her to stop, to turn around, to run. But the voice was too powerful, too seductive. Every cell in her body seemed to pull her forward, urging her to obey, as if she had no choice. When Lydia reached the portrait, the room around her seemed to still, the shadows retreating like a wave receding from the shore. The oppressive weight that had settled in her chest seemed to lift, just slightly, as she stood in front of the painting. She could see the woman's face now in startling detail. Eleanor's eyes, were they always that blue? Seemed to glow in the dim light, like twin orbs reflecting the moonlight. There was something hypnotic about them, something that made Lydia's heart race faster, her palms slick with sweat. For a long moment, Lydia simply stared. Then, as if in a trance, her hand reached out toward the portrait. The moment her fingers brushed against the cold surface of the canvas, a jolt of electricity shot through her entire body, and the world around her shattered. The clock tower spun, the walls twisting and warping, the floor buckling beneath her feet. The shadows that had once lurked in the corners now surged forward, swirling in a dark vortex around Lydia. She felt herself falling, spiraling deeper and deeper into the void, her mind screaming for release, but her body too numb to react. The air itself seemed to scream, a guttural, howling wind that reverberated through the very core of her being. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Lydia gasped for air, her chest heaving as she found herself standing in a place that was not the clock tower. She was no longer in the room with the portrait. The floor beneath her feet was soft, covered in a thick layer of mist, and the sky above was a deep, inky black, dotted with stars that twinkled faintly in the distance. The air was still, heavy with an otherworldly tension that made her skin crawl. She wasn't alone. The whispers were back, but they weren't just in her mind anymore. They were everywhere, echoing in the darkness around her, coming from all directions, too many voices to count, each one desperate, pleading, calling out to her. Help me, one voice crooned, its tone familiar. You shouldn't have come. Another voice, softer, like the rustling of dry leaves, murmured, she's here. A cold shiver ran down Lydia's spine as she turned slowly, her heart pounding with dread. Her eyes locked onto a figure in the distance, a woman draped in white, standing motionless in the fog. It was Eleanor, her face still obscured by the shadows, but Lydia could feel her eyes upon her, watching, waiting. Eleanor's lips parted, and for a moment, Lydia thought she could hear her speak, but no sound came. Instead, a flood of images rushed into her mind, flickering memories of a time long past, of a girl who had once lived in Silver Creek, who had loved and lost, whose soul had been trapped within the clock tower for centuries. The images were fragmented, disjointed, like broken pieces of a shattered mirror. Lydia saw Eleanor, alive, smiling, a young woman full of hope, but as the memories swirled, they grew darker, twisted. Lydia saw her fall in love with a man who was not what he seemed. She saw betrayal, heartbreak, and then the curse. Eleanor's spirit had never left Silver Creek. She had been bound to the town, to the clock tower, for eternity. And now the curse was calling to Lydia. "You're the key," the voice in the darkness whispered. "You're the one who can break the cycle, or become part of it." Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she felt a tugging at her heart, an invisible thread pulling her closer to Eleanor. The woman in white took a step forward, and Lydia instinctively took a step back, her body frozen in fear. The air grew heavier, the shadows pressing in around her. The fog thickened, enveloping her like a suffocating blanket, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were closing in on her. "What do I do?" Lydia thought frantically. "How do I stop this?" And then, in a chilling voice that seemed to come from every corner of the world, Eleanor spoke. "It's too late, Lydia. The choice has already been made. You've come too far to turn back now." Lydia's heart stopped as the darkness swirled around her, and she felt herself being pulled toward the woman in white. There was no escape now. The curse had claimed her. The world around Lydia twisted, the fog thickening like an impenetrable veil, clouding her senses and distorting her thoughts. The whispers, once distant, were now so close she could almost feel the breath of the voices against her skin. Every step she took forward was met with resistance, as though the very air itself was fighting against her. She could hear Eleanor's voice in the distance, beckoning her, calling her deeper into the fog. "You can't escape," Eleanor whispered. The words were soft, almost like a lullaby, but they carried the weight of 1,000 years of sorrow and regret. "This is where you belong, Lydia. You've always belonged here." Lydia's mind raced, her heart thundering in her chest. The voice had spoken to her before, earlier in the clock tower, but it wasn't until now that she realized the truth. It wasn't just the town that was cursed, it was the land, the very air that she breathed. It was the clock tower itself, the heart of the curse, and it had been waiting for her. Waiting for someone to break it, or perhaps to complete it. She stumbled forward, her steps unsure as the fog thickened even further. She could no longer see the figure of Eleanor, but she knew that she was near. The pull of the curse was like an invisible thread, tugging at her chest, drawing her in closer to the woman in white. She couldn't resist. The more she tried to fight it, the stronger the pull became, as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting, moving with an unseen force. Her breath quickened as she pushed forward, the mist swirling around her like a living thing, suffocating and claustrophobic. Her thoughts were muddled, jumbled. Was this a dream? Was she still in the clock tower? No. She could feel the cold on her skin, the dampness of the fog, and the weight of the curse pressing down on her. This was real. She was here, in this place, in this moment, and there was no going back. Suddenly, a sound broke through the oppressive silence. The soft, unmistakable chime of a bell. It was faint at first, distant, but then it grew louder, tolling with a deep, mournful resonance that seemed to shake the very earth beneath her feet. It was the clock. The bell. It was tolling again, just as it had on the night she first arrived in Silver Creek. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. She remembered the stories the locals had told her, how the clock had never stopped tolling, even when the hands had frozen at midnight. How the chimes rang out, marking the passing of each soul that had fallen victim to the curse. Each toll had sealed someone's fate, and now it was her turn. Her pulse raced, the urgency of the moment sinking in. She had to find a way out. But how? How could she escape when the very town itself was alive with the curse? When the spirits of the lost souls lingered, watching, waiting for someone to join their ranks. She glanced around, but the fog had grown so thick that she couldn't see beyond her outstretched hand. The only thing visible was the dim, eerie glow of the clock tower in the distance. It was still standing tall, a monolithic structure that loomed over the town like a silent sentinel. The clock tower held the answers. Lydia was sure of it. But she couldn't reach it. Not in this fog. Not in the clutches of the curse. Her legs trembled, and for a moment she thought she might collapse from the weight of it all. She had been chasing the truth, but now that she was here, she wasn't sure she could face it. She had uncovered so many secrets, so many dark truths about Silver Creek, the curse, and Eleanor's tragic past, but none of it had prepared her for this. None of it had prepared her for the feeling that she was slipping away, being consumed by something larger than herself. A soft voice, like a faint breeze, drifted through the fog. Lydia, it was Eleanor again, but this time, her voice was filled with something darker, something almost malevolent. You should have stayed away. You should have listened to the warnings. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to do. Her mind raced for an escape, but there were no answers, only the growing weight of the fog, the suffocating presence of the curse, and the tolling of the clock. And then she saw it. A flicker of movement in the mist. Someone was standing there just beyond the veil of fog. The figure was tall and imposing, draped in dark clothing, their face hidden in the shadows. The figure stepped forward and Lydia's heart skipped a beat. For a moment she thought it was Eleanor, but as the figure drew closer she saw the truth. It was a man. His face was hidden by a hood, but his presence radiated an overwhelming sense of power and malice. "You shouldn't be here," the figure spoke, his voice deep and cold, each word dripping with an unnatural chill. Lydia's blood ran cold as she tried to step back, but her body refused to obey. The curse was taking hold of her. She could feel it creeping up from her feet to her chest, tightening its grip around her heart. The figure's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, an unnatural red that burned with a hunger she couldn't understand. "You're too late," the figure said, his voice a low growl. "The curse is already in motion. You cannot undo what's been done." Lydia's mind spun as she struggled to breathe, her thoughts a blur. This man, this figure, he was no ordinary spirit. He was something else, something more powerful. He wasn't just a part of the town's past, he was the source of the curse, the one who had bound the souls of the lost to Silver Creek. He was the one who had cursed Eleanor, and he was the one who had now set his sights on Lydia. "You think you can break it?" The figure laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the fog. "You can't. You're too weak. You're just another victim of the tower." Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as the figure drew closer, his presence suffocating. The fog seemed to grow thicker with each step he took, as though the very air was becoming heavier, more oppressive. She tried to move, to escape, but her body was frozen in place. The curse was pulling her in, and she had no choice but to face the darkness that awaited her. "You can never leave," the figure whispered, his voice sending a chill through her very bones. "Once you've come here, there is no escape. You're mine now." The fog closed in around Lydia, and the last thing she saw before it consumed her was the figure's eyes, glowing, unblinking, and filled with an ancient hunger. And then everything went black. The darkness pressed in on Lydia, the air thick with an otherworldly cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She could no longer feel her feet on the ground. It was as though the fog had completely enveloped her, swallowing her whole. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat sounding louder in the vast, empty space around her. Every breath she took felt like she was inhaling the very essence of the curse, the weight of it settling deep within her soul. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her body was immobilized, trapped in the thick fog that had turned into a suffocating wall. The pressure around her intensified, as though the very air was pressing against her chest, trying to crush her from all sides. Fear gripped her heart, and for a brief moment she wondered if this was it, if this was the end. If she was just another lost soul to be consumed by Silver Creek's curse. But then, as if answering her unspoken thoughts, a distant voice echoed in the mist. It was a soft whisper, barely audible, but it was enough to make Lydia's pulse spike. She strained to hear it, her mind racing, trying to place the voice. "You cannot run from this, Lydia." The voice was cold, almost serene, but it sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the fog. It was the voice she had heard before, the one that had been following her since she arrived in Silver Creek. Eleanor, the woman in white. But now there was something different about her voice. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was an invitation. The fog around her seemed to stir, swirling as though it were alive, and with each passing moment, the darkness grew deeper, more suffocating. Lydia's vision blurred, and her thoughts became tangled. Was this a dream? A nightmare? No, this was real. The curse was real, and she had no idea how to escape it. Suddenly the air shifted. The oppressive weight around her chest lifted, just slightly, enough for her to take a shaky breath. It was as if the fog had parted, but not in the way she had hoped. Instead, the mist receded just enough to reveal a different kind of darkness, one that was more ancient, more insidious. Ahead of her, through the lingering haze, she could see something. A shape, a figure, a dark silhouette standing motionless in the distance. Its form was indistinct, yet somehow familiar, like a shadow from the corner of her eye. She couldn't place it, but she knew it was waiting for her. It was a presence that had been watching, following, stalking her since she arrived. And now it was drawing her closer. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and run, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't move. The fog, the curse, it had her in its grip, tightening with every breath she took. The figure before her began to take shape, its outline sharpening in the dim light of the fog. Lydia's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. It was the man, the one who had spoken to her before, the one who had warned her that she could never escape. His eyes gleamed through the fog, red as blood, glowing with an intensity that felt unnatural. His presence was overwhelming, a dark force that seemed to draw the very light from the world around him. Lydia tried to step back, but her body wouldn't obey. She was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to escape. She could only watch as the figure took a step toward her. "You think you can break the curse?" the figure said, his voice low and smooth like the rumble of distant thunder. His words were filled with contempt, each syllable heavy with the weight of inevitability. "You think you can defy fate?" Lydia's breath quickened, her throat tightening as she struggled to find her voice. "What do you want from me?" she managed to whisper, her words trembling with fear. "Why me?" The figure's lips curled into a cold smile. "Why you?" he repeated, his voice filled with a mocking amusement. "Because you're the one who has been chosen. The one who can finish what was started." Lydia's mind reeled as she tried to make sense of his words. What was he talking about? What had been started? And why was she the one who had been chosen? The curse, the fog, the clock tower, everything was becoming a blur of confusion, and yet she felt the pull. She could feel the curse tightening around her once more, threatening to consume her entirely. "You're the key," the figure continued, his voice growing darker, more insistent. "The key to releasing the souls trapped in Silver Creek. You have the power to end this, but it comes at a cost. A sacrifice." Lydia shook her head, her mind racing. A sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice? She didn't want to be part of whatever twisted ritual he was talking about. She didn't want to play a role in the curse that had plagued this town for so long. "You can't force me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I won't let you." The figure's smile faded, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something cold, something ancient. "You already have," he said, his voice dripping with finality. "You're already a part of it." Before Lydia could react, the fog shifted again, swirling around her like a living, breathing thing. It seemed to tighten around her, pulling her toward the figure as though the very air had become a prison. The curse was closing in, and there was no way to escape it. She felt the presence of the figure behind her, his cold fingers brushing against the back of her neck. She gasped, the sensation sending a shock through her body. His touch was like ice, numbing her from the inside out. "Welcome to the end, Lydia," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. And then everything went black. The air was suffocating, thick and heavy, pressing down on Lydia with an almost tangible force. Every breath felt like an impossible task, as if the very atmosphere was trying to crush her. The darkness around her stretched endlessly, a void where nothing seemed real, where time itself no longer had meaning. It was as though the entire world had ceased to exist, leaving her suspended in an endless night. Her mind raced, desperately clinging to thoughts of the world she knew, but they slipped away like sand through her fingers. What was she doing here? Was she really alone? Was she trapped forever? Her heart hammered in her chest, every beat reverberating in the emptiness, every sound magnified 1,000 times. The weight of isolation pressed upon her like a physical thing, and her pulse quickened. She was alone in this oppressive void, but she could still feel something, or someone, watching her. The presence of the curse, that unseen, unrelenting force that had haunted Silver Creek for generations, was all around her, closing in. It was as if the very fabric of reality had begun to unravel, threatening to swallow her whole. "You can't escape." The words echoed in her mind, a whisper that wasn't a whisper at all. They came from every direction, reverberating in her skull, a mantra that sank deep into her consciousness, leaving no room for rational thought. They were the same words she'd heard before, the same cold, detached voice that had guided her through this nightmare. The voice of the man, the figure she had encountered earlier, and yet it wasn't just him anymore. His presence was everywhere, seeping into her thoughts, twisting her very perception of reality. Lydia stumbled forward, her legs trembling with each step as if the ground itself was unstable beneath her feet. She reached out, desperately seeking something to hold on to, but there was nothing. The space around her felt infinite, stretching in all directions, an endless abyss where escape was a distant memory. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Every step only seemed to draw her further into the darkness, deeper into the curse that had consumed Silver Creek for so long. Then, out of the darkness, a faint light flickered. At first, it was barely perceptible, a distant, almost ethereal glow, but as the seconds ticked by, it grew brighter, stronger, like a beacon cutting through the night. Lydia squinted, her mind struggling to focus on the strange apparition before her. Was it real? Or was it just another trick of the cursed world she found herself in? She dared not trust anything. Was this a sign of salvation, or yet another trap? The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices rising in volume as the light drew nearer. The sound was deafening now, each word heavy with malice, with the weight of all the souls trapped in Silver Creek. It's too late. You're already lost. The curse is inside you, Lydia. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She could feel the pressure building around her, a wave of panic rising in her chest. She had to keep moving forward, but every step felt like an eternity. The darkness was closing in, swallowing the light with each passing second. And yet, the light grew brighter, stronger, like it had a magnetic pull on her very soul. Don't go toward it. The warning came from deep within her, the last flicker of rational thought trying to push through the fog of fear and confusion. But she couldn't stop herself. It was as if the light had an invisible force, a pull stronger than her will, drawing her closer despite every warning. It was the same feeling she had experienced earlier when the curse first whispered its insidious secrets to her, an overwhelming compulsion that she couldn't fight. With a trembling hand, Lydia reached out, stepping toward the light. Her heart raced, her breath shallow and quick. The whispers grew louder, like 1,000 voices converging on her from all sides. She tried to block them out, tried to focus on the light ahead, but it was impossible. Every step seemed to pull her further into the abyss, deeper into the dark heart of Silver Creek's curse. The figure appeared before her once more, tall, cloaked in shadows, his eyes glowing red like embers in the pitch-black night. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. He was here again. The man. The one who had cursed Silver Creek and all who dared to enter. But this time there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. They were filled with something darker than hatred, something far more sinister. The hunger of the curse was in his gaze, the unrelenting drive to consume all who entered the town. "You don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice low, dripping with contempt. "You thought you could break free. You thought you could change fate. But the curse is as old as the town itself. And now, it's yours. Forever." Lydia's heart sank, terror seizing her. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I won't let you win. I have to." The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, an expression filled with malice and amusement. "You've already lost. You always have." His words were like a death sentence, and in the depths of her soul, Lydia felt their truth. She had never truly escaped, never truly been free. Silver Creek had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before her. The curse was inescapable, an eternal cycle that no one had ever broken. His shadow seemed to stretch, wrapping around Lydia like a heavy cloak, closing in tighter with every passing second. The light was almost gone now, snuffed out like a dying ember. The darkness took its place, flooding her senses, suffocating her. Lydia tried to cry out, to fight, but it was as if the very air around her had thickened, making it impossible to move or speak. The ground beneath her feet began to shake. The trembling intensified until the very earth seemed to convulse, groaning in agony. The air vibrated, pulsing with a sickening energy. Lydia's pulse quickened. She could feel something huge, something ancient, stirring beneath the earth. It was as though the town itself had awakened, ready to consume her whole. Suddenly, a loud, bone-rattling crash echoed through the darkness. The sound of something massive, something ancient, being unleashed. Lydia froze, the blood draining from her face as she turned toward the source of the noise. The world seemed to tremble with the force of it. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her body was paralyzed, frozen in place by the weight of the curse. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of anguished voices filling the air around her. "You can't escape. It's too late for you. The curse is eternal. You're already ours." Lydia's legs finally moved, driven by pure survival instinct. She turned away from the figure, her heart pounding in her chest. But the darkness seemed to close in around her, swallowing her every step. She could hear the man's footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, growing closer with every passing second. Lydia's heart was in her throat, her breath shallow and erratic. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, as if it were closing in. The footsteps echoed louder, closer, until they seemed to surround her from all sides. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the walls of the cursed town pressing in on her. There was nowhere to run. And then the world went silent. Everything stopped. The footsteps ceased, the whispers fell away, and for a single heart-stopping moment, Lydia was suspended in a void of pure silence. She dared not move, afraid that if she did, the curse would snap its jaws shut around her. Then, from the depths of the silence, came a voice. Lydia. The voice was unmistakable. It was him. The man. The curse. You can't escape, Lydia. It's too late for you. Her blood ran cold as she spun around. But the figure was gone. The darkness was now absolute, consuming everything. And Lydia knew with a sickening certainty that the curse had claimed her. Her body was no longer her own. She could feel the curse wrapping around her, sinking into her very soul, merging with her like a second skin. The whispers had quieted, but the weight of them pressed heavily on her mind, leaving no room for escape. It was as if the darkness itself had taken over her thoughts, had claimed her body and soul. The town is alive, she realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity. Silver Creek doesn't let anyone go. Not truly. Once you're here, you're part of it, forever. Lydia's last breath caught in her throat as her body trembled. She had tried so hard to escape, to break free from the curse that had claimed so many others before her. But now she understood. There was no escape from Silver Creek. There never had been. The town had won. And as the last flicker of her consciousness faded into darkness, Lydia became one with the curse, one with the town she had tried so desperately to leave.